It's the 21st of June. That this is the time that we talk about medical conditions that affect us the most. It is Medical Matters on Capital Radio 88.1 FM. And this is where we are every Thursday between 7 to 8 p.m. on your local radio station. So this evening is no different. We're talking about COVID 19, a topic that is still very, very much prevalent today as it was a year ago, with multiple strains being discovered and more questions than ever being asked, especially with things like the vaccines developing and patients developing new symptoms. So we've got in studio one of our popular guests. He sparked quite a lot of controversy, quite a lot of questions in the last two interviews that he done earlier this year. So we thought, what better person to get in studio? And you've asked for him, so we've asked Dr. Chetty to come back into studio to talk to us a little bit more about what has changed from the last time we've seen him in January with regards to COVID 19. So, for those of you that aren't familiar with him, I'm going to give you a quick recap. Dr. Chetty has an in-depth insight on the disease process with coronavirus because he has a background in genetics, advanced biology, as well as medicine. So he comes with quite a lot of history. He's been a medical practitioner for many years. He has a private practice down in the South Coast. And he's had quite a lot of exposure to COVID-19 patients where he's been able to treat them privately at home. Not many have been hospitalized, but he's going to talk to you a little bit more about his own experiences about it. Dr. Chetty, thank you so much for taking the time again to join us in studio. I know how busy you are. So I hope we're going to have an incredible show this evening as well.
Thank you, Doc, and thanks for your listeners joining us.
We had quite a lot of input from the last show, hey? Did you also find that on your side? Because we had lots of listeners that called in and asked us more questions. So we were hoping to maybe get you back in today and answer a lot of the things that came up from the last two sessions that we did have with you. So do you want to quickly just give the listeners that didn't listen to you the first time around a brief cap about what we spoke about in the first two interviews?
Okay. I published a paper in Modern Medicine in November last year, outlining my theory of the pathogenesis of COVID illness. What I had discovered from examining and treating patients myself was that there was something occurring on the 8th day that didn't fit into the usual picture of viral illness. Subsequently, I found that the first 7 days was typical viral illness, and on the 8th day, in sensitive patients, we seem to trigger a hypersensitivity reaction, which was the cause of all the mortality and morbidity we were seeing in COVID illness. Mm-hmm. So I treated it as such. The article was published. It went out to 35,000 doctors around the country, and it got some great response overseas. So far, I have passed 3,500 patients. In all, we still haven't had any hospitalizations or deaths. The few deaths that we had were patients that were hospitalized by family because of concerns, patients that presented far too late to be treated in our outpatient facility. Mm-hmm. So we've had some very good recovery rates. I've had since a lot of queries from around the world on the biphasic nature of this illness. There's a Dr. Marcus Sanchez Gonzalez from Lapan State University. He's published a paper with the theory of this hypersensitivity, and we met and discussed. We now have clinical evidence and pathological evidence of this being the case. With any hypersensitivity reaction, it's vitally important to predict the start so that we can initiate treatment timeously. The longer these reactions are left, they cascade out of control. So the 8th day became something very important. I think it has been the biggest thing in saving lives in my practice. Every patient that comes in gets interrogated about their day their symptoms started. They get to be told when their 8th day would be. And I actually had to print out a post-dated script for those patients who'd have the reaction over the weekend when I'm not available. And so I educated them that on that particular day, if they noticed The common symptoms that heralded the onset of the hypersensitivity being joint pains, fatigue, or dyspnea. And if they noticed those symptoms on the 8th day, they would add what I'd written on my post-dated script to their current medication.
Okay.
It saved a lot of lives, and the script became very popular.
Okay.
So the prediction of the 8th day was the most important thing in saving all these lives. We've had very consistent treatment clinical outcomes, and the treatment we use is reasonably safe. It's proven to be effective and is relatively cheap and available. So we've had now this move towards early treatment. Previously, patients were asked to isolate and only present when they were critically ill. Now there's a move towards early detection and early treatment. But it's vitally important that we understand that the PCR test that we've been using, besides the flaws in the test itself, there's also the flaws in the way the test is done.
Yeah.
And of course, to get any perspective from those tests, we'd have to test everyone every day. Because for negative test today could be a positive test tomorrow. So there's no time frame to the result itself. So a lot has changed in that, seeing that the PCR tests are not that effective. I guess we're going to have to change the way we look at the data we've collected around COVID illness.
No, that's
And I think
very true.
we look at it in a different light.
Yeah, that's very true, especially about the testing. Because at hospital ourselves, many of the times you see the doctors, lots of us feel unwell, and you get your test first. We've got two. We've got a rapid test, which comes in, you get the result within an hour or two, and then you do the formal PCR test. And a lot of people have come back negative, but when you speak to them, I'm telling you, I definitely do not feel well. I have symptoms, and we're insisting, but we're saying we've got two tests. We have a rapid that's saying it's negative. We now have a PCR which is confirmed as negative. You can't possibly have it. But like you said, it is, there's always that window period where it's not picking it up, and it can have lots of false negatives as well.
Look, Doc, as well, because we're dealing with a biphasic illness, I think that the testing itself, we should be relying on our clinical skills to diagnose coronavirus, rather than rely on a flawed test. I've had many patients test negative, but have the hypersensitivity reaction on the 8th day. So from a cost perspective, I think it's wasteful to test people. So I decided that I will only test everyone would be considered to be coronavirus positive, and isolate and take their meds. And I would only test those patients who presented back on the 8th day with a recurrence of symptoms.
Okay.
Because normal flus and things don't recur on the 8th day.
Okay.
So I limited my testing to patients who came back on the 8th day. Look, those are a small subset of the coronavirus cases that we see, but if we're not using a very reliable test and using it on a broad base, the information that it's giving us is of no value when it comes to population statistics and looking at population management measures. So the test itself, I think it has really had very little benefit in my practice in diagnosing coronavirus. A simple example, I had a patient that I suspected with coronavirus, and I educated him about his 8th day. He tested twice in that period, and both tests, RT-PCRs, came out negative. He had a reaction on the 8th day. I started him on the relevant medication. He went and repeated the test on the 8th day, and it still remained negative. So I did an X-ray. It didn't show the typical features of coronavirus, so I started to question myself as to whether I'm dealing with a bronchopneumonia or something like that. But immediately I stopped the steroid, he worsened. And so I put him back on steroids and ordered the usual CRPs and interleukins and the rest. But while he was still critically ill, I asked the lab to run an antibody test, and it came out positive. Okay. So that actually is a very strange result, but it speaks to the biphasic nature of the illness. What actually happened with him was, in the first 7 days of viral illness, he developed antibodies. But the antibodies play no part in the hypersensitivity reaction, which is
Yes.
actually the severe part of the illness.
Mm.
So he got severely ill with a hypersensitivity reaction, even though he had antibodies to the virus itself.
Okay.
He did recover, but it proved the ineffectiveness of testing as a means to make a clinical diagnosis.
I think with the testing, it's also, remember, there's a whole cold chain event that occurs from the time of testing to the time of transport to the time of actually getting to the lab where it gets tested. There's lots of room for error in that scenario. So, you might have taken the sample itself might not have been taken properly, or it had been taken properly, and along the way, the cold chain was broken, and that's probably one of the reasons why you might have had insufficient or inaccurate reading. So there's lots of room for error for these particular tests. So since we are talking about clinically relying on that clinical skill, what should people be looking for in terms of signs and symptoms? And the reason we're stressing signs and symptoms is because you need to document when you first have that occurrence, because remember, we're going to count your days from the first day you noticed a change, and it's your 8th day that we're looking at where things are going to change over. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the biphasic nature in more detail. So Dr. Chetty, do you want to expand a little bit more about exactly what patients should be looking for in terms of signs and symptoms?
Okay. In the first 7 days, it is a typical viral illness. So you get the spread of severity that you usually would in a flu. Some patients a majority of patients tend to present with a sore throat. Some, the sore throat lasts a day and they have no further illness. It looks like a complete recovery. Others, the sore throat persists. Of course, everyone knows about the loss of smell and taste that goes with this. Fever, but I've had quite a few patients without presentation with fever. Generalized body aches and pain, typical symptoms of a viral illness.
Mm-hmm.
Those 7 days, the initial 7 days, are not really that important in the greater scheme of things. The reason we want patients to come in early is so that we can interrogate them about the day they felt unwell. Doctors have been asking me about how do I get to that, because people will have a snotty nose for 2 days and they say that's the usual. But I think the question to ask when patients say it started on Monday, the question to ask is, were you perfectly fine on Sunday? Patients tend to know when they started to feel unwell. And of course, each one of us normal is different, so they know they're normal. So I think you have to rely on patients understanding the normal and understanding when they realize they're actually unwell. And that is the first day of illness. Using that, I educate them about the 8th day, which is exactly a week later. And doc, it's almost to the hour. I've had patients develop symptoms in the evening and 8 days later develop new symptoms in the evening. So the prediction of that start of the second phase is vitally important. Like any hypersensitivity reaction, like a bee sting, the quicker you get to the patients, the less problems you'll encounter in suppressing that reaction.
Okay.
On the 8th day, so it becomes vitally important for patients to note their 8th day. On my aim in the first 7 days is to get patients as well as possible, so that I don't have an overlap of symptoms from the first 7 days, compounded by new symptoms on the 8th day that go unrecognized.
Okay. So the question will then be, as a patient, and I start noticing these changes, when do I come into my doctor? When do I go in? Immediately? Do I wait a few days to be sure? What would be the best advice?
The day you start to feel unwell is the day you go and discuss it with your doctor.
Okay.
Some people, if you come in 5 days after you got the flu, then it becomes difficult to remember the exact day it started.
Okay.
And of course, that gives me 5 less days to get you well for the 8th day. So the earlier you present, the more time I have to deal with any changes in your symptoms or complications, so that I can have you well by the 6th or 7th day.
Okay.
And so on the 8th day, the symptoms that herald the onset of a hypersensitivity reaction are more noticeable to you.
Okay. So in terms of treatment, I am going to be at home for the first, hopefully the entire duration of my COVID infection. So up until the first 7 days, what is the treatment that I need to get me well and prepared for that 8th day?
That would be dependent on how severe that initial illness is. But the common things that you need to keep are basically an anti-inflammatory, paracetamol for the fever, an antihistamine to keep your nose dry, maybe a cough syrup if you develop a irritant cough. There are other medications that I institute in the first 7 days uh, in anticipation of what might transpire on the 8th day. There are medications that have been shown to be protective. Even if you don't have that reaction on the 8th day, best be prepared.
Okay.
It might be a fight for your life on that day.
Okay. Okay. So this is in addition to all the immune boosters that patients are taking, the vitamin
All
C,
that
the
kind of
vitamin
thing,
D, all of that. So you're going to add the antihistamine, the anti-inflammatory, the paracetamol as symptomatic treatment for that.
Yes.
Okay.
As well, we found that doxycycline tends to have a great benefit in suppressing protein synthesis and in such prevents transmission because you've got people isolating at home with families. So it's been shown that when you're on doxycycline, you don't infect everyone else very easily around you. Doxycycline also has been shown to decrease the severity of the illness itself. So it's an antibiotic that we use not for its antibiotic properties, but for its effect on viral replication and that kind of thing.
Okay.
The other two medications that we consider early on are aspirin or clopidogrel, simply because we're anticipating clots and thrombotic events later on. And montelukast has been shown to be more effective if started a little early.
Okay.
These medications are relatively harmless, but can be of great benefit on the 8th day if started reasonably early.
Okay, okay. So talking about the clots, it seems to be coming up quite a lot in media at the moment with the vaccines and everything. So do you want to talk about why some patients are more predisposed to clotting at this particular time in the disease?
Okay. I think what we need to do, Deshni, is to look at the disease as a biphasic illness, and everything we look at needs to be put into that perspective. When you look at, and as well, the disease has been classified as mild, moderate, and severe. That is a very vague classification when you look at a biphasic illness. It doesn't tell you which phase you're in and how people have responded. As far as I've seen, the first 7 days have had no complications at all. I haven't had a single patient get into trouble in those days.
That's true.
So if you look at the hypersensitivity phase, that is where all the morbidity and mortality resides. So what I've done is I've changed the way I classify the illness. Mild illness, you got basically 4 types. One is patients that have the viral illness with absolutely no hypersensitivity reaction. That viral illness can be a sore throat for a day, or it can range through the full tooth, but in 6 to 7 days, they're generally well. The second would be a patient that has that kind of viral illness, irrespective if it was a sore throat for 1 day or progressed through the 7 days. But they had a self-limiting, short-lived hypersensitivity reaction that didn't require treatment. It resolved on its own. So generally, the first and second group can resolve reasonably well without any treatment because they're not going into a severe hypersensitivity. The third group would be those that have the viral illness and have a moderate but prolonged hypersensitivity reaction. And the final group would be those that have the viral illness and have a very severe, rapidly progressive hypersensitivity illness. Those are the patients that would end up in hospital on ventilators. The third group with the prolonged illness would be what we call our long haulers.
Do we have any way of identifying which group patients fit into?
Now, look, I don't think we should be waiting for the bee sting to take effect before we decide where to classify you. I think on the 8th day, everyone should be treated like a severe hypersensitivity reaction until we can prove otherwise. The medication to stop, suppress, and treat a hypersensitivity reaction doesn't pose any threat to your life if you don't have one. So we should not withhold treatment to wait and see how severe this reaction might be.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing I noticed on the 8th day, the symptoms drew patients to me because I'm in a community where I cannot be doing testing on every patient.
Yeah.
But for those that I could afford to do testing on, I noticed that the CRP levels and the interleukin 6 levels were a good indication of the start of a reaction. Because generally, patients on the 6th and 7th day had very mildly elevated CRP and interleukin levels. But by the 8th and 9th day, there was a definite spike in those values in patients who exhibited the signs of hypersensitivity. So those blood tests can be used to predict the onset of of the hypersensitivity.
So for those of you that are listening, the CRP and interleukin markers that Dr. Chetty is chatting about now basically gives you an indication that there's some sort of tissue damage and inflammation that's happening in your body. And we watch these levels to find, it gives you an extent almost of the severity. We have ranges. So within a certain range, you think, okay, fine, it's not so bad. But once you start climbing in the numbers, we know that that whatever's happening is getting to become more severe, which is why we send you for repeated blood tests over a period of time in hospital. It just gives us an idea of whether we're on an upward trend and we need to start worrying a little bit more, or when we're on a downward trend and we're doing the right thing and we keep on course. That's purely the only reason we're doing it, and that's the things that he's talking about now. So Dr. Chetty, I just wanted to know, in terms of treatments and when to initiate. So you're going to start on the 8th day with all your your medication for your biphasic, your second part of it.
Okay. The hypersensitivity phase, Doc, the aim there, basically what's happened with the hypersensitivity is that a tap has been turned on that's pouring out chemical mediators. So your aim is to, as quickly as possible, turn off that tap, and that is the job of steroids. And of course, to mop up all the mediators that have already been released. The common mediators are your histamine, prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and very importantly, platelet activating factor, common mediator. So the histamines, we use two histamines that have shown benefit for the upper respiratory tract are your levocetirizine and promethazine. For those that exhibit GIT symptoms, cimetidine seems to be the one that works the best there. Leukotrienes are cleared by montelukast. And in those that have the reaction, I've had to increase their dose of montelukast to BD twice a day, just to mop up any leukotrienes that might have been released. Platelet activating factor is a very difficult mediator to try and inhibit. The choices that we have there are your aggregation inhibitors, aspirin, which everyone knows about. There's a tablet called clopidogrel as well that we use in patients to prevent clot formation. As well, this is something that I don't think anyone has considered looking at. But if we could have a receptor, platelet activating factor receptor antagonist, then we could suppress the effect of released platelet activating factor. Now, we don't have any pharmaceuticals that can do that. But there's a substance years ago that was investigated called Ginkolet B, which has been shown to be a platelet activating factor receptor antagonist. And it's found commonly in Ginkgo biloba, the leaves of the Ginkgo biloba tree. So this is a very common supplement used. It's supposed to improve brain function.
I'm not going to lie and say I take it when I study. I do think I find it quite beneficial. So I've been taking it for many years, especially when I am studying.
I think that's something we should be looking at because it might help us prevent the clots.
Yeah.
Then there's been problems with anticoagulation because those patients that have developed clots were put onto, by World Health Organization protocols, were put onto Clexane. And a lot of them developed hemorrhage. Now, if you look at how platelet activating factor is actually working, it's causing microthrombi because of the aggravation of platelets, but also sapping away your platelets from your blood. So you've got patients with thrombi with very low platelet counts. So anticoagulation can lead to very severe bleeding. So I found the best way to actually treat these patients without the risk of bleeds is to watch their D-dimer levels, but react with medications like Xarelto, rivaroxaban. They do not hold the potential for such severe bleeds.
Mm.
But I found in every patient with very raised D-dimers, within a period of a week, I managed to get them back down to normal with that.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop you
So
for a
I
minute
think
there
that's
because
the important thing.
we always, to everyone that's familiar with the show, you do realize that we always end up cutting up halfway through. So we're going to do that in a few minutes now. It's going to give Dr. Chetty time to come back in. But just to recap, he's talking about D-dimers. Again, it's another blood test that we use. It gives you an indication of your blood's clotting ability. So it gives us an idea of thinking whether a patient is at risk for clots or thrombi, as he's talking about, and it gives us an indication of when we need to start acting, if these at what particular levels they are, and when we need to now start putting in intervention. So we need to do these as precautionary tests for patients with COVID because, as we all know, clotting has become a huge factor in the pathogenesis in the entire process of the disease. When we come back in a minute or so, we're going to delve a little bit more into the actual immune response that the body has in terms of when you have a COVID infection to give you a better understanding of where to go next. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back in next, we're going to chat about COVID-19 in more detail. Hi, if you're joining me, it's joining Dr. Deshni Chanan on Medical Matters. And this evening, we're talking about COVID-19 with Dr. Shankar Chetty, and we're revisiting it to find out all the things that have changed from our last interview with him in January. And remember, you can always get a hold of us on 06542111380. We are streaming live on our Mixcloud account, as well as our YouTube and our Facebook Live. So remember, if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask. We're talking a little bit more about COVID-19. There's so many things that have happened since the beginning of the pandemic last year in March. So the questions that have been posed to better understand the disease is to what happens when it enters our body? How does your immune system actually try to fight it off? Dr. Chetty?
Deshni, could I please take the opportunity? There's one other treatment that I need to discuss.
Sure.
One simple treatment. There's been a lot of talk about ivermectin, and how it should be used. There's a lot of controversy. A lot of these research papers, if they're not looking at the illness as in the biphasic nature, they lack content. And so we're going to have all this controversy. Look, I used ivermectin. I started using ivermectin in March last year. I had about 20 tablets that I got from a friend, but I knew where I needed to put it into the illness itself because I had the understanding of a biphasic nature, and I think people need to understand that. Ivermectin is used in the treatment of filaria. These parasites, when they die in your lung, cause eosinophilic infiltration of your lung, and it presents exactly like coronavirus with a dry cough, dyspnea, drop in sats, all that kind of thing. Ivermectin's been shown to clear eosinophils from your lung, and that is how it works. So in the hypersensitivity phase, that is where ivermectin does the trick. In the viral phase, it doesn't seem to have a benefit. Now, the first line of treatment for pulmonary eosinophilia is actually a medication called diethyl carbamazine citrate, which is used in the treatment of filaria. And I wish the world would go and investigate that because it's been shown to clear eosinophils in the lung within 24 hours. So I think we're not understanding the nature of how ivermectin is meant to do what it does. Using it in the early phase is going to create controversy about it not working. Also, the plant that's been mentioned in South Africa, Artemisia, is used in very same way. It clears eosinophils from your lung and is used to treat filarial disease, and I think that's where the benefit of that plant comes in clearing eosinophilic lung infiltration.
I think that's why it's so important to understand the pathogenesis of the disease, is because once you understand, that is the basis of any treatment, is when you understand what that disease is doing in your body, you have an idea of when to use the medication, because obviously each medication has their own pharmacological action, and you know at what point it needs to be instituted. So like we're saying, there's all the controversy with lots of people saying ivermectin works, the others saying it doesn't work. It's purely understanding the pathogenesis and what is meant for ivermectin. What does ivermectin actually do in your body? And only then would you be able to know when to institute it to be able to have the proper effect that it needs to do. So that's why I thought, explaining your body, explaining how your body is handling the infection itself is so important for people to understand. So do you want to explain, once it gets into your body, what are we doing? How is our immune system helping us out?
The immune response to this infection as well should be divided into two phases. We have two different immune responses. The first is an immune response to a virus, and we want to develop immunity to that. The second is a hypersensitivity reaction, which might kill you. So you want to suppress that. So if you look at the way we respond to this virus, it's got to be separated into those two distinct responses. Sometimes standing on your head gives you a different view. So I'd like to start by first getting out the hypersensitivity part of things, which is a very simple thing. The hypersensitivity reaction is similar to a bee sting. There's a genetic predisposition, so a familial allergy would play a part. And like I mentioned, we've seen a lot of father and son deaths where mothers have been spared. We've seen a lot of genetic predisposition, and I use that to warn other members of the family as to their predispositions to a hypersensitivity reaction from COVID. This is independent of dose of the allergen, so no matter how mild your initial viral illness is, it doesn't preclude you having a very severe hypersensitivity reaction. What we find as well is that the hypersensitivity will only occur in those patients who've had symptomatic viral illness. Asymptomatic patients, or well, we can't call them patients that they were asymptomatic, we shouldn't have been counting them, but they do not ever present with a hypersensitivity reaction.
Okay, so when you're saying asymptomatic, you're saying with no symptoms, as in you had no myalgia, no joint pain.
Yeah, these are the people diagnosed from a test.
Okay.
They were perfectly fine, they got a positive test, they had no symptoms, they never have a reaction.
Okay.
Right? And what we got to understand is that this hypersensitivity reaction, the aim is to detect it, suppress it, and treat it as soon as possible.
Right.
As we leave it, it will spiral out of control, and this part of the immune response is what's responsible for all the mortality and morbidity we are seeing with coronavirus.
And that's
So
what's
it
happening
becomes
from the 8th day, hey? That's what we.
from the eighth day
Okay.
onwards, right? Now, if we look at what's happening in the first 7 days, the viral phase of the illness. Now, I think it's pragmatic for me to first explain what we're seeing in waves. People don't understand why we're having all these waves with the virus. Now, this virus is very, very prevalent in our population. So no matter how much you decide to lock down or mask up, this virus is going to spread. Now, what makes me say that? The PCR testing is not being done routinely. It will never be a good measure of this virus's prevalence in our environment. But a recent study published by the South African Blood Services, they tested patients who had no history of COVID that have come to donate blood. And they found a 64% antibody level in them, which shows in that population, which was the black community in South Africa, we're getting to herd immunity. And I've managed to verify that in the second wave that we had. I had a drastic decrease in the number of black patients that presented with coronavirus. According to the PCR test reporting, the incidence is only 3%. So I think the PCR is underestimating the prevalence of this virus. The blood services report did not look at whether the patients were symptomatic, severely symptomatic. So from the antibody levels, I can't draw any inferences about infection and immunity. The only inference I can draw is about its prevalence in our population, which shows that this virus spreads quite drastically through.
Yeah, it's quite rapid.
And is almost immune to all the lockdown measures and the isolation measures and the rest. If you've got 64% of your population that has been in contact with coronavirus, it says a lot about trying to isolate this virus and using those kind of measures to control its spread. That's the first point. Then, another study that was done showed T-cell responses. Now, T-cell responses are an indicator of long-term immunity. Now, these T-cell responses were found to be directly proportional to the severity of the initial viral illness. So people that had severe illness had stronger T-cell responses. Those that had very mild illness had milder T-cell responses. But antibody titers cannot be linked to illness severity. There is no correlation between the two. So we cannot use antibody levels as a measure of immunity.
Okay.
We got to look at T-cell responses. Now, in explaining the waves, the virus spreads through the community itself, and it spreads greatly without us knowing. At some point, we will develop herd immunity. At that point, the virus cannot spread further. And that is when we'll have a decrease in the wave. Now, looking at that herd immunity, there are two types. One, in those that were asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic, it would not have triggered a sufficient T-cell response, and they can be reinfected. Also, those that were not exposed and got away because of reaching herd immunity in the general population can get another infection. So, after a period of waning, those transient antibody levels start to decrease, and your population will become susceptible again to now a second wave of the virus. But all those that developed symptomatic illness in the first wave will not get corona again in the second wave. Remember that the hypersensitivity reaction is dependent on having the viral illness. So if you develop sufficient immunity not to have another viral illness, you will not be exposed to hypersensitivity again.
So I'm going to stop you there just to reiterate. So you're saying that the reason that people that have been reinfected, because there have been multiple people that
Yes.
have had second infections is because the first infection was obviously not severe enough to have caused a high level of T cells to be able to prevent you getting your next infection. Is that what
Yes,
you're
it
saying?
only stimulated an antibody response,
Okay.
not a T cell response.
Okay. And so
Now you must remember those patients that were reinfected could have been asymptomatic patients who shouldn't have been counted in the first place. They were not ill. They were just positive cases. Now, when you look at reinfection, the risk of reinfection is only 10%. And it's 10% in the mildest initial illness. Those that have severe illness will not get reinfected. Those that have mild illness stand a chance of being reinfected at a rate of 10%. Now, that 10%, when you look at the reinfection, their viral loads are 10 times lower than their initial viral loads. So patients that get reinfected are 10 times less likely to transmit the virus.
because they've had a second
I
infection.
haven't heard about a third infection.
Okay.
So the second infection is warranted as a booster to trigger sufficient T cell immunity to stop getting infected.
This comes into a whole immunity and understanding how immunity in your body works and why when you get vaccines you get booster doses and what we're trying to elicit in your body's response. So that was actually a perfect segue to be able to ask my next question, which is going to be about the vaccine and why do we need the vaccine? Like, how do vaccines work in your body in the first place?
Okay, before we delve into that, just a short, simple explanation of what this immunity in our T cell immunity in our body actually is. When you get infected with the virus, your body takes the viral protein and chops it up into little pieces. And then all those little fragments of the virus that are in you, you will develop an immune response to each one of them. So your natural immunity is very broad-based. It covers that entire virus. And so your broad-based natural immunity would not wane in different variants. A variant of the virus, if you look at how it's made up, the most different variants from the original coronavirus are only 3% different. Now that 3% is a very small percentage of the overall virus. And that's the reason natural immunity is total, irrespective of the variants of the virus. So people that got infected with the variant that was prominent in the first wave were immune to the variant that was prominent in the second wave, because your body's got many pathways to defend itself against a new variant. Now, the new variants tend to have differences in their spike protein. Now, that spike protein is what attaches the virus to your body. It is only a small portion of the virus. Now, if you look at it in the South African context, the mutation that we had caused a change in the spike protein.
Yeah.
That change in the spike protein created a few things. The virus became far more contagious because it could attach to people a lot better. We found a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms. So it seemed to have a propensity for the ACE receptors in your gut. And the change in the spike protein seemed to trigger a far more severe hypersensitivity reaction, being far more allergenic. So the spike protein itself is just one component of the entire virus.
Could the severity in that hypersensitivity reaction be because of sensitization from the first wave and exposure?
Now that's something, yes, that's something, Doc, that I've mentioned in the article, and a lot of countries are now going through their second wave, and I think that they need to be very cautious. I think we were misinformed to think that whether you diabetes and high blood pressure and age and all these comorbidities played a risk in the mortality and morbidity. I think the first wave affected people over 55 because that was the group that was sensitized. They were likely to have been exposed to a similar kind of coronavirus previously and had the antibodies to react in a hypersensitive way if they were allergic.
Yeah.
Young people, this being their first exposure, did not react, but they would have been sensitized. And when they have a second infection in the second wave, we will see a far younger audience being affected. And that is what we've seen in South Africa, and that is what we'll see around the world, simply because these young people have now developed antibodies to react in an allergenic way to the spike protein. So we've got to be very cautious about classifying it as a disease of age or classifying it as a disease of comorbidity. Looking at it from a bee sting perspective, I think a bee doesn't care whether you're fat or thin or whether you have high blood pressure or diabetes. Neither does the bee kill you, nor it stings. But if you're allergic to bee stings, you need to be very cautious.
That's true. So talking about the variants, we've spoken about the first and second. So what would your predictions be for the third one?
Look, I think that counting the variants, looking at their genetic makeup and all that kind of thing is absolutely irrelevant in the greater scheme of things. Natural immunity being broad-based would cope with any variation because these variations are a very small percentage change in the overall virus, and natural immunity fights the overall virus. The thing with variants is we're making vaccine. Now, the thing with the vaccine is that we, just to make you understand, our audience understand what these vaccines are meant to do and how they're engineered, there are two kinds of vaccines, the mRNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines. But the main aim is to introduce a piece of RNA into your cells, and that uses your cell machinery to make the spike protein. When your body manufactures that spike protein, the hope is that you will develop a response to that spike protein, which will be remembered. And when you are exposed to the virus, this immunity will recognize the spike protein on the virus and inhibit it. But we got to consider that the spike protein that we are introducing is very specific. And so any mutation in the viral spike protein will render the vaccine ineffective. And that's what we've seen. Now, vaccines will never ever provide us a broad-based immunity like natural immunity. So the looking into the variants is more to look at the vaccines and why they don't seem to work. So vaccines trigger a very narrow immune response. Now, we've got to consider as well that by introducing the spike protein into your body, we are sitting with a hypersensitivity reaction to the spike protein.
Yes.
So if you look at the side effects that we've seen with the vaccine, they are exactly the same as the hypersensitivity response to the virus. Patients report with body aches and pains, fever, dyspnea, fatigue, and in time, clots. Just like we have from the 8th day onwards with a normal infection. So we've got to be considerate as to whether the vaccine is actually stimulating sufficient immunity to be viable, or is it exposing us to an allergen, and in so doing, allowing us to be a little more tolerant when we get the infection. Now, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding the vaccines, and I just want to make a few things reasonably clear. The vaccines themselves, they are very specific entities for a specific spike protein, and they will only be effective against that variant. Now, to date, we have absolutely no way of predicting who will have a severe allergic reaction, or as uh, internationally called, severe illness. Now, I did in my previous interview speak about looking for immunoglobulin E or such so that we can isolate those that are most at risk, but we haven't gone down that road. So if we can't tell who's most at risk of severe illness, how can we claim efficacy against severe illness? We don't know who's going to get it. Now, as well, the controversy that has been sparked worldwide, from my perspective of hypersensitivity, I would say that the people most at risk of having a severe reaction are those that are prone to allergic reactions. So people that suffer with allergies to common things, that are more allergic, have an allergic propensity. I would say people with an allergic propensity are more at risk of having severe illness. Now, when you go to take the vaccine, if you have any history of allergy, you're precluded from taking it. That skews the cohort in favor of the efficacy of the vaccine.
Because you're not going to
So
get
are
side
we
effects.
vaccinating people that didn't need to be vaccinated and are not at risk of severe reaction? And so that makes the vaccine look like nobody got severely ill, because the vaccine was only given to those who might not have been at risk of being severely ill. So I think we need to put into context all these little things that might occur with the vaccine.
Yeah.
People must remember as well that this is an experimental set of vaccines. Messenger RNA has never been used before in this setting. So we have no short or long-term data about efficacy and safety. They've set up the vaccine adverse event reporting system. I don't think the GOCO in the middle of the Eastern Cape knows how to use that. So we're going to be wholly underreported, and this would leave a lot to manipulation and sales pitches. So I think science needs to come first. Now, with the vaccines itself, there's been concerns about things like antibody enhancement, which has been seen in animal studies. This is something where the vaccine actually makes you more prone to having severe illness because it recognizes the virus but does not kill it. And because it attaches to the virus, your body thinks it's part of itself, because now it's got a part of you stuck to this virus. And so it allows entry into the cells far more easily. There's been concerns about viral escape. Now, in layman's terms, viral escape is basically mutation. Now, what viral escape means, everything on this planet is blessed with adaptability. And that adaptability is broad-based and is chosen through selection, natural selection usually. Now, if you put the virus in a corner, it's got a whole lot of mutations. The mutations that can get it out of that corner will start to spread. Now, this is natural with RNA viruses, but lockdowns, isolation, mass vaccination is putting unnecessary pressure on this virus, and it will enhance mutations. So we're going to get a lot of further mutations. For those of us that have had COVID, it means nothing. For those of us that chose to be vaccinated, it has grave implications, because then you need another vaccine, because something's changed.
Okay.
So it becomes important to look at that perspective, and of course, the hypersensitivity that this spike protein might be triggering when introduced into your body. I've had a lot of friends and family who've taken the vaccine and had severe reactions from it. But it would not be pragmatic to introduce an allergen into your body that is long-lived without understanding its long-term consequences. Introducing such an allergen that is not, unlike seasonal flus or spitting out a peanut that you're allergic to, this might stay in you for a long time and trigger a long-term allergic response. That might lead to a lot of allergic autoimmune conditions. we've seen incidences of neuropathies, Guillain-Barré, a lot of those kind of immune pathologies with side effects to the vaccine. So we've got to look at that perspective.
So basically, with patients wanting to take the vaccine, so the aim of the vaccine is to do what? To help prevent the infection, to help decrease your severity to the infection? What is the idea behind it?
Look, I think those goalposts keep moving. We were told at the beginning that if we took the vaccine, we can lose our masks and get back to normal, and it was the only thing that would bring us back to normality. After starting vaccination campaigns, I think very quickly the vaccinators realized that ain't the case. You can still get infected with coronavirus and you can still transmit it. So masking still exists, social distancing still exists. So a lot of people have been disillusioned simply because they expected to take a vaccine and go back to normal life.
Yes, exactly.
So those things are, that is something that we need to be very cautious of. And I think when you are doing this kind of experiment on a broad population, the boundaries and what you're trying to achieve must not change. If you keep changing those parameters, you leave a lot to manipulation. And so we need to be very cautious about how we look at the reporting of data based on these vaccines.
So as it stands, we're taking the vaccine, but we don't really know if it's going to prevent us getting the infection, and we don't know if it's going to prevent the severity of that type of infection should we be infected.
Look, it's been shown that the vaccine does not prevent you getting the infection. A lot of people vaccinated have been infected. All that has happened is they've been infected with a variant that is not covered by the vaccine.
So that went on to speak about how you said that there's spike proteins, that it's mutations within the virus itself to be able to now spread itself out because
to overcome the vaccine limiting it. And so those variants that can overcome vaccines will always be selected for. But they got enough hosts that are vaccinated for the wrong one. So they'll keep spreading in that way and require further development of vaccines continuously. As well, you find that with vaccines, the concern with vaccines is that when you vaccinate someone, the response that is formed immunologically might distract your immunity away from actually responding to that infection when you get it. So you won't have a good enough T-cell response when you're vaccinated. And as well, we've seen shingles in cases of vaccine. That is likely to be because of your immune response being distracted and not keeping one hand on shingles. Varicella zoster stays in your body all your life. And it's always have a cap on it with your immunity. So I think we need to be cautious when you take a vaccine and suddenly find that shingles showed up. It shows that your immunity has been distracted in another direction. And so we've got to be very cautious about where these vaccines actually fit into the greater scheme of things. I think with my pathogenesis of COVID, the virus hasn't killed anyone. It's the reaction to the virus that's killed people.
That's purely the hypersensitivity reaction.
Exactly. So I've been talking to researchers around the world, and I can't understand why we are so hell-bent on counting bees and chasing bees and not treating the sting. Counting COVID is of no consequence to us. This virus is not killing anyone. But if you're allergic to it, there's a risk to you.
It's your reaction to it.
And so we need to start looking at treating this. Remember, if we could find ways to stem all the mortality and morbidity that is caused by COVID infection, then we would have no reason to vaccinate. Because nobody's dying and nobody's being injured by it. And natural immunity would be the best vaccine you could have. And if it wasn't sufficient, you'll get a booster dose in the next wave, all for free. So we got to look at what nature does and how we're going to impact on that.
Okay. To sum it up, though, so the entire aim of today's show is basically to reiterate the pathogenesis of COVID-19 and to be able to stress to you the importance of paying attention to your signs and symptoms and to make sure that you document the first day that it happens, because you need to understand it's a biphasic disease. It has a flu-like symptoms initially on the first 7 days, and your hypersensitivity reaction from the 8th day onwards. And it's that transition phase that is your culmination and the most problematic part. And it's almost the defining point in what your outcome with COVID-19 will be, is how you treat it from the 8th day on, which is what Dr. Chetty is trying to stress. And so we're trying to make patients more aware of being very, very vigilant in terms of paying attention to your signs and counting the days specifically, and to be able to seek treatment earlier on as opposed to waiting until things tip over after the 8th day. So, Dr. Chetty, do you want to sum things up quickly, because we are quickly running out of time in terms of COVID-19?
Look, on the 8th day, I think that we should, we've stressed that enough, that the 8th day is so vitally important. The three symptoms that I find herald at onset: body aches and pains, specifically burning kind of joint pain, fatigue, or breathlessness. Breathlessness can take a few days to develop, but those symptoms, even if one of them occur very mildly, should not be taken lightly. It is vitally important that if the day before you were fine and you wake up on the 8th day and are feeling fatigued, that is a sign of the start of a hypersensitivity reaction. And the quicker you get to suppressing that, the less consequences you will have.
So to reiterate, to suppress the hypersensitivity reaction are treatments like?
Now, with the hypersensitivity, steroids are the mainstay of stopping the process. I found with this wave, the hypersensitivity reaction was far more severe, and as such required far higher doses of steroids. When I gave patients the post-dated script, I had to look at the average steroid dose that was working across the community I'm treating, and that turned out to be 80 milligrams a day, which is 16 tablets a day. People were shocked, but I've had patients with even far more severe reactions where I've had to up that dose, and I've had patients on doses close to 100 milligram TDS.
Wow.
Maximum dose of steroid is closer to 500 milligrams a day, and we should not avoid using a high enough appropriate dose just because we feel it's too much of steroid. We will prolong the illness, and we'll have a lot of difficulty mopping up all the other mediators that cascade out of control because of not having enough steroid at the start. The others are treating mediators: antihistamines, Montelukast, and something to prevent the clotting that's there.
So your aspirin and
Ivermectin is important when we have eosinophilic lung infiltration. There are other medications we should be investigating in that direction. If that is not caught early with ivermectin, you get the cell-mediated damage, your cytokine storm. That requires far higher doses of steroid and prolonged treatment with steroid. The art there would be to look at immunomodulators rather than immunosuppressants. So when added to your steroid, you could decrease the dose of steroid. The one that has shown the most benefit in that direction is azathioprine.
Okay.
Added to the steroid, it tends to modulate your immunity, but you can decrease the dose of steroid. There's been a lot of concern about side effects of steroid, but that's no reason to stop the steroid. None of these medications should be stopped because of concerns about side effects, simply because the alternative is death.
Also, the steroids are not being used for an indefinite length of time. There's usually a very short time period. You're not using it for months on end. So higher doses at a shorter period is not going to be very detrimental to you. So I think the aim of today was basically to try to sum up to everyone what COVID-19 was, what it was doing to your body, what are the advances that we've made, what are the implications of things that we've now encountered over the last year and a half, to be able to say these are the two phases that we have encountered, these are the treatments that are readily available. There is hope out there. It doesn't mean that if you have COVID, the infection, it means mortality. If you understand the pathogenesis of the disease and you seek treatment timeously, you can very, very much overcome the disease itself, and you can go on to have a healthy, normal life. Again, Dr. Chetty, thank you very, very much. I know how busy you are. I know how passionate you are about this topic and about getting the awareness out. I hope to everyone that's listening that the show has been beneficial to you. Remember, you can always catch us on a Thursday between 7 to 8 p.m. with myself, Dr. Deshni Chanan, on Medical Matters, where we discuss topics that you have been asking us for. So remember, we will chat to you next week. Wherever you are, be safe. Take care. Thank you again, Dr. Chetty. It has been amazing. So guys, remember, COVID-19 is still very much around with us. Social distance, wear your masks, sanitize, and we will speak to you next week. So from myself, Dr. Deshni Chanan, be safe.